Start by saying thank you from the depth of my heart. And can you hear me? Yes? Cool. I want to say thank you to the Taylor Center for inviting me. I want to say thank you to Amana for thinking of me, and for Chris for letting me present this particular idea and helping me sort of mold it in a way to fit the goals of design thinking Gumbo. Also for the Indigenous acknowledgement, because this is the first time I've actually seen someone do that online, which is important because we're still occupying the space here, or no matter where we are in North America. So this is important. So my name is Sunshine. My last name is Best. Thank you for everyone who signed on, because you're giving me a portion of your Friday and is getting towards the end of the semester and the end of the year. And I'm sure that there's plenty of us who have a significant amount of Zoom fatigue. So this is something I'm hoping visually will be more appealing, and will be able to take you sort of out of the space of Zoom and into maybe your research or ideas or things you've discussed in your social circles or things you've wondered about and maybe had no one to talk to about it. A member of a number of different initiatives that they did when I was doing my undergrad a few years back. And now that I've spent more time in academics and have completed, I'm finishing my master's degree this year. Actually, I'm graduating in December with my master's, and my goal is to continue with my doctorate. I recognize the importance of this work that Taylor Center is doing more than ever before. So this is again why I wanted to tie the public health point of view to design thinking, because I found that it actually does, no matter what field you're in, there's a way to tie design thinking into our work. So the topics that I'm focused on today are how to think differently. And basically, I'm very much about identifying opportunities to solve issues from the cultural perspective or from a population's perspective. So it requires a little bit of constructive criticism. So I'm not a disruptor for the sake of being disruptive, and I don't believe in destroying things for the sake of destroying it, but I definitely believe in being constructive with it. So I called it a constructive deconstruction of Western educational thinking with regards to how some things are continuing to be brought forward and continually practiced because they're saying that this is the way it's always been. But there's also ways that predate that are not being acknowledged. And I'm hoping that we can tie all these things together in order to serve social justice aims. So following the path with open eyes. So we are here. There are many of us on this call who are in different phases of academics. So whether you're a student or you're a faculty member or you're a staff member, there's certain roles that we have to perform if we're agreeing to be a part of this institution. So I'm not saying that Western, please don't misunderstand that I'm saying that everything in Western education is wrong or needs to be torn down. But I think it's important that we walk this path with open eyes, because we can learn from anywhere, from anyone, from anywhere at any time, depending, of course, on the context. So we can walk this path with open eyes. However, we need to also keep in mind that there's an opportunity to observe and question the gaps. So the idea for me, and I talk about it a lot, is acknowledging the gaps in the knowledge, the pre-existing knowledge, the gaps in the knowledge that we have in our minds in terms of what we're comfortable thinking about, as well as looking at alternative paths of thought. So there's more than one way of knowing. There's more than one way that knowledge has been transferred throughout time, that expertise does not only come from having degree credentials. And I think that there's other ways of knowing, such as life experience, that could be valuable. And anecdotal knowledge is often put down in certain contexts, but I think that there's also an opportunity to look at anecdotal knowledge as maybe a red flag of an area to go deeper into. And if you collect enough of that or aggregate enough of that anecdotal knowledge from different people, you might find a pattern. And then once you put numbers on it, now it's an authentic, certified way to go about a study. So it's just a matter of how we can find alternative paths for thinking to solve our problems. Exercises for challenging your thoughts. I have a couple of things I can talk about working for me in the past, because this path that I'm on is not new to this degree program I'm in. It's not new to my time in New Orleans. And I was really happy to see that the Blackspace Manifesto, which we're going to speak about briefly, I believe they have 14 points that they have in the manifesto, and there's 7 that I'm speaking about in the context of public health practice. So please take a note of any questions you might have, or put them in chat so you don't forget. And I'm going to be happy to address them, or anyone that's on the call can address them from their perspective. And then, of course, see if there's a way that we can tie it into your current career path. So for me, the words that I live by in the morning, that I try to keep in the front of my mind before I leave my house, and to be able to try to stay motivated, because some days, you know, we're human and we have our vulnerabilities and struggle with different anxieties or depression. I have to focus on why I'm doing what I'm doing every day. So I remind myself to walk my path. I know that my goal, that I don't know what I don't know, and I am looking for opportunities to expand my mind. So I call it building my toolbox, and that's my spiritual toolbox, my intellectual toolbox, my experiential. In terms of I do this as in my physical and emotional and intellectual and academic toolbox I carry with me, just to refer to whenever I'm solving a problem. I have to challenge myself every day. And I recently had a win yesterday that I I believe very much that you lose every shot you don't take. And I take a big shot about 6 months ago, and it actually came through. And so now I'll talk about that later. So challenge yourself every day. Note the details. So there's always an opportunity to learn. There's always an opportunity to challenge something. If someone says something or something you read and it doesn't make sense to you, you don't like it, take note, because that could be something that you can build on, or something that you can actually work to correct. Because if that's a larger issue, then that's something you may have an opportunity to do research on in the area that people aren't already looking at, and then share that with the people. Mind the gaps in your knowledge, mind the gaps in the knowledge is being taught to you, and repeat every day. Every day is a process, and it requires it requires focus. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and my experience. To some people who have maybe less vision or don't understand, maybe grew up in a world where siloed thinking is the way to go and that's the path for success. I've never believed that. I don't believe that there's any one way to fulfill one's life or to gain experience or to build my toolbox. So I realized that there was a pattern, you know, hindsight's 2020, as they say. I realized there was a pattern in my actions because I've always been in community service and I've always been in some level of education. And as a person who grew up as a ward of the state, and meaning that I grew up in foster care and orphanages, I never grew up with a regular family. I didn't live with one home for a long time. That definitely exposed me to different ways of knowing, different ways of doing things, and even a different set of survival instincts. But that carried through to my adult life in terms of my approach to how I solve problems, and even to a certain level of what other people consider my fearlessness. So there's a newspaper article there of me in a yellow chef coat. I'm actually a trained chef, but I was cooking long before I went to culinary school. And right as I was graduating from culinary school, I went to school in Toronto, which I'm from Barbados and I grew up in Toronto, but I spent a large portion of my life there, and I did culinary school there. And just as I was graduating, I found out that I couldn't digest wheat. So I couldn't eat most of the stuff that I learned to make, because the way culinary school was taught then is that like Europeans invented cooking. So everything was based on French and Italian cooking. And it struck me as odd coming from the Caribbean, knowing the influence of Indian food in our culture, and that Indians and people from China are outpopulate everyone in the world, but there was zero representation in culinary education. So excuse me, that mindset helped me develop a solution to the problem I was diagnosed with. So I was diagnosed with celiac disease, which is the inability to digest glutens found in wheat. And instead of defaulting to what is immediately around me, which is the information that's basically spoon fed to you through media or through the immediate American resources, I found that looking at different cultures in the world, and had been my interest in plants had already been activated at this point because of how I grew up in Barbados. Wheat is a plant like any other, but it grows within certain climate ranges. And being that I come from, and my family comes from the tropics, because my family's from Suriname and Guyana, so wheat didn't grow in most of those places until it was introduced in some of them. And so if the highest populations in the world come from these two places, and wheat is not a stable part of their diet, then how were they making pancakes? How were they making like flatbreads? How were they doing things? So I basically used a lot of my time to go to these places, because I was fortunate enough to have worked in IT and project management as a implementation project manager for small companies and for larger Fortune 500s. And I took my vacation time and went to different places and learned how to cook and some of the traditional ways, using a black eyed pea flour or sweet potato flour or plantain flours, in order to achieve certain results that wouldn't take away from taste or texture of wheat products. So that was the beginning of how in hindsight, I recognized I was taking disparate ideas and connecting them to resolve issues. I started a business as a result of that, and it was Sunshine's Food, and subtext that doesn't suck, because when you talk about uh, foods from the perspective of vegan, vegetarian, or health foods, or foods from the African diaspora, people have no idea what you're talking about, or health foods having a negative connotation of being bland. I figured I'd get people's attention by naming it something like that. I lived in Chicago. I see people here from Illinois and Chicago. What's up? I spent 5 years there. That's where I went to school and studied sustainable urban agriculture. And that was a huge, huge turning point for me in terms of a milestone, because I was able to connect some of the stuff that I grew up with knowing, and then adding the Western science understanding of it, but from a sustainable context. And I had an opportunity there, because my internships fell through, to utilize what they taught me to address an issue in the community, because 2008 is when that food desert study popped out in Chicago. And I realized that the community gardens that they were propagating and they were pushing tended to not match the communities ethnically that they were in. The community gardens I see most often throughout much of North America, especially at this time in 2008, 2009, had a lot of like lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers. And basically those are things the colonizers liked. And Chicago has, their puzzle pieces of diversity. So, the north side of Chicago, when I was living there, had a lot of the Vietnamese population, Southeast Asian population. Bridgeport was Italian, and South Chicago was Irish, and Pilsen was heavily Hispanic. So I figured if they had community gardens in any of those neighborhoods, like the Vietnamese neighborhood should have bok choy in their garden, right? Like they should have things that they actually eat from the culture. So community garden should look like the community. So I developed a tool to see if I could figure out how to get the information from traditional knowledge into a way that people would access in modern day, not putting in a book, because nobody seems to read books anymore. And I wanted it to be accessible to someone if they needed the answer right away. So I came up with a thesis during this time, and I was able to build and connect aspects of sustainable knowledge with traditional practices, recipes in terms of food, beverage, first aid, how to build cob houses. And here's a picture of me with the green bandana. That's when I did my trip around the world when I finished in Chicago. I spent 2 years, 3 months traveling, working on farms through WOOF. If you've never heard of WOOF, that's Worldwide Organization of Organic Farming. And they started in 71. There was a woman in England, I believe, who realized that there's a bunch of places around the world who have small organic family gardens, but they don't have the funding to hire workers. So because they're in cool places, people want to travel, she would sell access to this list by subscription per year. And you can spend, at the time, I think it was 18 euros or 18 pounds. It was 18 pounds. And I had access to the list. I contacted 15 of the farm sites. 9 of them responded, and I went to see 6 of them. I saved my money for a year. I planned it thoroughly. I used Facebook as through my connections, because I was at this time, I also had the bakery going, and I was able to make friends all over the world, and I touched base with people. So I literally traveled and lived on farms, and I worked on boats and in houses and in yachts, making money so I can travel basically from place to place. Again, I do not come for money, and I figured out how to do it. So that strongly influenced my ferociousness in terms of like, I can get stuff done. Let's just figure it out. There's always a way. Don't let excuses stop me. Just figure it out. So that developed other ideas. So when I came to New Orleans, I realized that I wanted to again build my skill set in a different way, but not necessarily through the traditional means of medicine. I didn't want to go to medical school necessarily to help people, because when I traveling, people didn't need help with agriculture. They had that down. There were certain things that they needed, or information or access to information they needed, that I didn't see present. So I started thinking about ways that I can contribute to that. So I came back to the US, and I came to New Orleans to go to Tulane specifically to earn some credentials, so I can build on figuring out how to approach health using the information of knowledge and traditional knowledge systems and plants, and how different cultures use plants. And plant medicines have always been in my life growing up. And I wanted to make sure that people had access to that, especially seeing that these universities have all these scientific journals where they've actually looked into the mechanisms of action and how these plants work in the environments, and how they work in people's bodies, and what they interact with and may cause problems. All this stuff are in journals that nobody has access to unless you're affiliated with these places, that in words and vocabulary that most people can't read. And I felt that was a problem. So I decided to come up with sort of a tool that would integrate it into early childhood education and curriculum and community garden setup. And we'll talk about that a little later, but that's where the article at the bottom underneath the picture with me in the green headband, focused on plants medicine. That was here in the Times-Picayune. The other newspaper was the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Times-Picayune was in 2018, I believe. So there's pictures of me there, like building houses when I was traveling. As I said, I worked in kitchens all over the place, and there's a picture of me at the very bottom making coconut milk from scratch for like a bunch of farmers somewhere. So I believe very much as it sounds, again, like I'm all over the place, because that's how I've been described by less inspired people who lack vision in my vocabulary. I don't think that they really understand that no single discipline will solve any one problem. And I know Dr. Levis did not invent that line, but he's the most recent person I've heard say it, because I knew it was true. And I just like to hear somebody from the academic world acknowledge that. And for people who don't know, Dr. Thomas Levis is the current dean of the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, first Black dean of all 10 Tulane schools, actually, ever. So interdisciplinary, that's the nature, that's the word or the term often given to how I think in terms of pulling information from different disciplines and putting it together. So mobile technology and public health, it's been my understanding, especially being in this building for 2.5 years, that a lot of the mobile tech applications that have been employed so far have been more on a modern and evaluation or like measuring data aspect, but rarely for the intervention aspect. And I know there's one recently with Dr. Che was on NPR. I'm like a little old lady who walks around with my like emergency radio so I can listen to my radio shows and my podcast. So I enjoy listening to the radio just because I can figure out what's going on and what people are talking about, because I'm very mindful of my inputs. I don't watch television, but I do try to measure what I hear, and then hear like BBC, and then I try to keep my French up. So I listen to BBC France and all this different stuff so I can pull in information and see what people are doing. And BBC has a lot of very cool things that they talk about that are happening in different parts of the world outside of England and the United States. So anyway, going back to this is mobile technology and public health. Dr. Che is actually just was on the radio for a $1.5 million NIH grant to use mobile phones, mobile apps to help parents explain racism to their children, which I thought was very cool. And I immediately emailed, I was like, yo, I just listened to your thing on NPR. Congratulations, that's awesome. So that's an example of how they can come together. And I'm glad to see somebody in the school taking that direction. This is my tool that it was my thesis when I went to school in Chicago, and I called it Amnaya, and Amnaya is Sanskrit for basically acknowledging past and present usage. So or information or sacred knowledge from past and present uses. So this is a database that I actually was able to present in Oxford. Actually, I did a fellowship at Oxford University in 2018, and I got some really, really strong feedback and was able to connect with people from around the world. And I'm working to integrate this with a group in India and someone else potentially in their educational context in New Zealand within the Maori population. So this is the app / database I designed years ago. You see the little light bulbs when I came up with the idea in 2008, and then actualized it after I did my trip around the world. And I basically took 4 modules: how to grow the plants, recipes for use. Again, that's not food and medicine. That's not just food and beverage and medicine, but also how to build cob houses and first aid and all that stuff. Traditional knowledge, and it's an example of how like maybe we use ginger for stomach nausea, and other places use it for people with slow blood or slow heart rates to increase their heart rate on a positive way. And then there's evidence-based studies that have been done on, like, in terms of Western science, to identify the actual components in ginger that actually address inflammation, and that if it mixes with certain heart medications, if you have issues with tachycardia or your heart rate's already too fast, this ginger may not be right for you. That information is valuable to people, and it's already been studied. However, the people who practice nutritional knowledge may not recognize that they can conflict with certain medications. So this information should be in the hands of people. And the way that I designed it, and I haven't made it public for the mass public yet, because I haven't found a way to protect the traditional knowledge that's in it from places like pharmaceutical companies, which is a concern, as I respect the opinions of the people who shared this information with me from the different populations. I went to 13 countries when I traveled. So of all these places, I learned and talked to different groups and different Native groups or First Nations groups, and they have shared information with me that they did not want to make necessarily public because they're afraid of things like the ayahuasca and certain people taking their drugs or taking their herbal remedies as a recreational tool, which is sacred to them, and only certain people have access to deploy it or prescribe it or utilize it in certain contexts. But then there's people here who just think it's cool and want to be out of their head, and this is what they do recreationally. And it's just, it could be seen as a form of disrespect to the cultures who they've taken that knowledge from. And it's become so normalized to learn something that belongs to another culture and then take it and use it out of context, that it just seems like, oh, everybody shares things anyway. I think that's a potentially toxic mindset, and also very disrespectful to the cultures that they've taken it from. So in protection of that, I have not made it public outside of the groups that I'm working with, and they're using it in the context of their population. But it works like Wikipedia, which is called collaborative editing, which means that anyone could get in and add and build on it, just like you will with Wikipedia. And it also ties to a mobile app. So you can be in a certain place and tag, if you have certain favorite plants that you've already identified in your profile. And then say if someone came to visit me in Barbados to hang out with my family, and there's a certain plant that I had mentioned or added in there, and you have it listed as your favorites, your phone will notify you that you're in the place that grows these plants or that they're nearby, because we could use GPSs and GIS as a part of how this app works. Another example of how I've employed mobile tech in public health is in my first week here at the School of Public Health. I was trying to help a faculty member who said that they didn't know anything about how to address an issue that was brought to them when they were in Suriname. They were working with a minister of labor in Suriname, and said that one of the biggest issues they have is mercury exposure. And mercury was used as a part of mining and extracting gold, because mercury sticks and holds on to gold. And what would happen is that people would find little pieces of gold or mine it intentionally, bring it to these little shops. They're kind of like bodegas here, which dedicated only to, or maybe like check cashing shops would be the closest thing here. But except for they'd have the stove, they would take and weigh the mercury laden gold, weigh it, heat it up. The mercury would evaporate, which is problematic because you definitely don't want that in your skin. You definitely don't want to breathe it in. But this is how exposure would occur. And once it evaporated, they would just have the gold, they'd weigh it again, and the person would get money, and these check cashing equivalents would take the gold and process it in whatever way. So the Minister of Labor was concerned about this occupational exposure and spoke to this particular faculty member about it. And so I developed a tool. There's an idea based on questions that I had asked him about the population, what I can find online about this particular population, that most of the users that were doing the extraction process and heating the mercury were young, like early 20s Brazilian men. And when I asked them, well, did they use phones or what kind of technology? They're like, oh yeah, they had better phones than I did. Like they definitely had smartphones and they were constantly on their phones. I was like, cool. So I came up with this app that basically scans QR code stickers that would be put on filters, and it would not only remind them of to change the filter, but it would be integrated with their schedules, their work schedules, and their payroll. And I actually built another version of this for a construction company locally and sold it to them. So it integrates more things that they would use it for every day, because they don't care about mercury exposure if they're collecting a check. But once you put something in it, like a sort of a PSA, something like mercury exposure can affect things like erectile dysfunction, that's going to land in the mind of a 21-year-old Brazilian man, right? If they weren't hearing anything else you said, they're like, wait, something's going to happen to my what? So that type of information, I think, is just how it's presented in a cultural way. I had ideas about how to market it using footballers or soccer players that are popular in the region who may actually have family members that also do this, to have them promote it, because people listen to people in their community that they trust. So this is a whole thing that I never did anything with this one, but I did build off of this idea in a couple of different forms. The second way that I actually built off of this, and this is most recently I did for my independent study here, was I spent a little over 2 years working for Home Depot during my undergrad. It was one of the 3 jobs I had. I went from 5 in the morning to midday, did my classes, and I worked at bars at night. And my morning from 5 a.m. to 12 o'clock shift was at Home Depot. And I helped run the garden center. I spent a lot of time in the garden center, and I met a lot of people who are construction workers, and they would see me walking to school or to work in the morning, especially when my bike or my motorcycle wasn't working. And I would get rides from a lot of these migrant workers or these construction workers or outdoor workers. And a lot of them did not speak English. And it was fun being in a vehicle with them as they're giving me a ride because they feel sorry for me. They're trying to fumble through English, and all my Spanish is pretty much profanity. So it was a fun experiment to try to communicate, but they trusted me, and we would talk. And then outside of work, we'd recognize each other at Ideal and hang out. And they would start telling me their stories about things, about how they were trying to find a doctor for this, or they need insurance for that, or how they successfully navigate things in a country that necessarily doesn't want them there because they don't have the right documentation. I was able to collect a lot of these stories and try to create a tool to address some of the issues, and specifically heat-related illness, especially because they're working outdoors, and specifically here in New Orleans, and a lot of the work that they're doing. There's actually a lot of studies that say how much they're being approached, they're being affected by population, or affected by heat in ways that domestic workers or workers who are documented in the way that Americans wants you to be documented, they aren't doing the same type of work, or they aren't enduring the same type of exposures that some of these other populations are. So I created a tool, another mobile app, but this one's all in Spanish because the population we're working with is in Spanish. And I wanted to eventually tie it to a company like Univision and another trusted voice in the community to help promote it. And that way further work with the Ministry of Health equivalent in Mexico, so we can identify which indigenous populations are more likely to migrate here. So that way we can introduce their language, because you can't assume just because they're coming from Mexico, South America, or wherever, that they just speak Spanish, because there's a lot of political history there. And there's a lot of people who are on the lower on the socioeconomic scale tend to be from these indigenous cultures. So they're the ones looking for money, and they will come up here. So a lot of people I met didn't even speak Spanish that well, but that's what they can do. That's what got them here. And that the people here predominantly speak Spanish. So that's what they were learning. But I wanted to make sure that people were not left out. And so I built this tool, and I'd like to see it built out, but I'm not an island. I need help. Another interdisciplinary aspect is that I've been interested in, obviously, an ethnobotanist, as Amanda mentioned, and that's the ethnobotany. For people who don't know what it is, it's a study of how people in different cultures use plants. So I was interested in this because, again, that's how I grew up in the earliest years of my life before I moved to New York and then Toronto, is when we were sick or had a toothache, there were certain plants that people around knew to use to fix certain ailments. No one was going to Walgreens or CVS or Shoppers Drug Mart, which is what's in Toronto, or Rite Aid or whatever. We just went to the backyard or went to the bush and grabbed the plant. So this is how we worked. And I recognized as I traveled that a lot of places will use plants to solve a lot of different issues outside of health, related to health. So with the pandemic happening, I recognized that not everyone had access to a Home Depot to get masks, and respiratory protection is something that's been used a long time for lots of different exposures, from people working again in construction to working in agriculture. They would wear masks to protect themselves from breathing in certain things. So recognizing the viruses are very tiny, and that just using a piece of fabric won't necessarily cut it, especially since the gold standard is an N95, and we call it an N95 because of the two features that make it unique, is that the seal forces you, it's got to be sealed against your face. That's why an occupational health person has to make sure it's fit properly. It has to be sealed to force the breath to come in and out of the filter. And that filter has an electrostatic charge, positive and negative charge. Once electrostatic charges are present, those are the only things that can catch those little tiny particles that behave like gases in the air. So when you have that on a mask, that's when you breathe in, it can filter out 95% of the particulate in the air. So knowing that, I wanted to say, I wasn't trying to exactly create an N95, but I wanted to improve the filtration efficacy of what people already have access to. So if people already use cotton, because it's the most ubiquitous fabric or textile in the world, what could we do to make that better for people who have less access? So with some research, I figured out that some of the practices that we used to do back home when you're washing a shirt, for uniform classes, or like we had school, right? And we wore uniforms in school. So we had to wash our shirts by hand because we have a washing machine. We weren't rich. So I wash it by hand. And then they would give us some boiled water or from potato or cassava. And, we spray it on or sponge it on, we iron it, and we would starch our shirts. So our shirts are nice and smooth and thing, right? So I wanted to see if there was a way that we can modify a plant, because that's what's most accessible in the African diaspora and tropics, which is my primary area of focus. And what could we do to make a plant have a positive and negative charge, seeing that most plants, all botanicals are considered to be negatively charged. So I needed the positive. And so I figured out a way to do that using amino acids, and I got positive and negative charges. I tested it. And you see in the bandanas here, the first one where it reads treated, you could see through the bandana how thin it is. You can see the print on the other side, and there's droplets just beating on it. And you can still breathe through it. It doesn't smell, it's not funky. And then over here, whoops, I'm trying to make this bigger so you can see it easier. On this side, you see that the water is absorbed. That's where the water stain is. That's an untreated one. So it worked. And then I sent it to the University of Florida Atlantic University to get them to test 6 blind versions of it, blind copies of different masks with different treatment levels, flying colors. So I plan to publish this paper. I'm working on it in terms of my 2 jobs and other things that I'm working on. But that's another example of how disparate ideas can be brought together, especially coming from lived experience, which I think is underutilized, especially in this country, because people that can afford to come here, if you're not racking up debt, and even people who rack up debt usually have the experience that they were born into or whatever is predominantly around them. So my goals for is in terms of public health and global health, especially as I become a grown up, is to be able to integrate some more of what are accessible to people. So there's people who knew me for plants. So like, didn't she study plants? What is she doing with tech? And what's she doing with mobile tech? And she have a job in IT for 14 years. And now she's in plants. Like, it doesn't make sense. She's all over the place. Actually, a more inspired mind might recognize that what I've done is I've tapped into what's accessible or available. If a population has mobile devices, and the population we're working in is this how their primary means of communication, then let's use that. If it's a population who we're working with that specifically needs access to something or needs to be able to create something and they're already using plants, let's use that. And it could be anything. That's my way of thinking. And so I want to be able to start using some of these thought processes to address areas of like biodiversity for things like or sustainable cities and urbanization, maternal and child healthcare. So many ideas of things of people I've met and things that I've seen that we could be using to help support midwives, and using traditional knowledge systems and plants and practices and putting it on an app. So that way they have access to it. And again, people can share and build on it and connect it to some of these evidence-based studies that exist in journals and exist in libraries that these people don't have access to, but we can summarize it and we can get this information. We can bring it together and make sure that people get it. So these things like water sustainability, water practices in terms of processing gray water, all of this stuff is a part of where there's potential in knowledge share or knowledge mobilization, which is one of the things that I specialize in, is I'm taking the knowledge that's in traditional academics and making it useful and valuable and tangible to communities. Also, it can help policy, because once you digitize something, or once we can add some of these Western evidence-based practices, we can learn how to measure according to how the universities are teaching us, how to use qualitative and quantitative assessments based on the combinations of how these things work and how they see the world, and use it to be able to affect policy and changes on the long term on a larger scale. I think there's a lot of potential here, and it is underutilized in my experience. So here is the talking about the traditional pathways that universities teach. There's no one way of doing things, but then there's only one right way, there's people say. And so they talk about the scientific method. And scientific method makes complete sense to me. However, when you look up different ways or different definitions of scientific method, these are just a few examples of how they're generally saying the same thing, but the first step kind of differs. So I was often told about how the scientific method is I have to start with a question. How I'm always about problem solving. I'm trying to solve a problem. I'm looking at the wrong things. I'm like, yeah, but if you're living in a world where everything's perfect and there's nothing to be improved upon, what question would you have? You have to my mind, when you're working with a community or communicating with a community and they're saying that this is impacting me, this is wrong, this is bad, this is the problem. Okay, so then you have the problem, and then you find a question in that big world of problem they have. There's probably a singular question or set of questions you can pull from that. And so my idea is not to just go to scientific studies and literature to find the problem to form the question. I will integrate the scientific literature, but it's not my sole source of identifying the question or the problem. For the reason why I say that is because when I tried that mask, the plant-based surface applicant for the mask thing I just showed you, one of the initial feedback I received was, I'm solving a problem that nobody cares about. So in this person's mind, oh, he also said that you're solving a problem nobody cares about. If it was worth doing, don't you think it would have been done already? And it doesn't push science forward. So if in my mind, I thought, okay, well, I think that's a really interesting statement for a school or any faculty or research faculty to have. But I really believe that I don't think we should have to wait for someone to publish a paper to say that poor people don't have access to N95s or quality respiratory cover. I don't think I should have to wait for that. If I could see that this is a problem and I recognize through lived experience that this is going to be an issue, why can't I form a question to preemptively create a intervention before it becomes a bad issue? And I think that that mentality that holds that belief that you have to wait for something to be published is why most people don't know what public health does. And it took COVID-19 to recognize what public health is and the different facets it could take and its importance of it. Like nobody knows what public health it is until something goes wrong. And as soon as something goes wrong, everyone was like, why didn't you do something? What are you guys doing? What are you researching? How come you don't have an answer for this? So I feel like there's different things that we can do with the scientific purpose, and we can build on it, and we can add to it to make sure that people aren't being left out, points of view are not being left out. So the point of view is also extremely important, because there's a proverb that I love, and it's, until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter. And I feel like this also applies to what we're doing here in academics, especially when it comes to public health and various health disparities that have existed for a long, long time. And it's not just about checking boxes, like in terms of saying representation matters. It's not about checking boxes to make sure there are brown people in the room or in the conversation, but also the methodologies and the way that we go about research and the way we go about asking questions and identifying problems. I feel like there's a different way to approach how science is defined. So if you were to think, I know that I've been talking for a minute. So if you were to think, how do you define science for yourself? How do you define science? How do you define knowledge? Where do you find knowledge? When you're looking for information about something, where are your default references or resources? Where do you go? How do you find it? What do you consider real science? Right? Like those are important questions, because that will also tell you where you're starting from, where whatever's in your head, whatever you were taught. I'm not saying anything's wrong with that, but I think it's important to question it, because that's how we can do things better. So Westerners, I'm wrapping it up soon, so don't worry, I'm almost there. So for when it comes to defining science for most people in our culture, I think that, and then being that we're in this part of the world, as everyone that identified, most of them are here in North America, I think that most Westerners identify, when you think of indigenous, they think about music, art, drama, all these different things, but they never think of science. They never say indigenous science. They never think about how their ways of knowledge or their ways of knowing have helped them survive this long, and that there may actually be tried, tested, and true ways of going about doing stuff that never made it into our scientific papers or our scientific lexicon. And there's a point of view that when science is taught that excludes that point of view, that it could be considered assimilative or assimilative science education, where you're only teaching one side. So I know this, I think these slides are going to be available later, so you can read this later. And it's terrible to have so many words on one slide, but I feel like it's important to know. And I tried to highlight the colors, the lines that are very important. There are plenty of literature, plenty of writings out there that talk about science exist in every culture. So every culture has its own science, and it refers to the science of a given culture. They call that indigenous. So it doesn't have to just be Native American, but like even the way that there's a time period during Reconstruction where freed descendants of slaves found their own medicinal means, just as they did in Africa, or just as they pass it down, or as they work with the First Nations people of this land. They were able to find their own medicinal ways, and they had their own culture of how to get by and how to communicate with each other and how to share knowledge with each other. They had their own science. So it's not just indigenous. I don't want you to just keep in your mind that's only First Nations or indigenous or Native American people, but think of indigenous of it coming out of a specific community and unique to that community. And that's how they sustain their mother society. That's how they sustain themselves. That is their science. And a lot of this is time tested. I'm not saying it's always right or it's always accurate, but it's worth looking at, because a lot of these populations have stayed around for centuries, right? And when we ignore this way of knowing, this lived experience, then it becomes a problem and there could be side effects. So when certain cultures disregarded, outcomes may vary. I love this picture. I found it early, right after the lockdown. And I'm like, that says lots, because that's exactly the point of view that was coming across on why we're having issues communicating about best practices, about how to mitigate the exposures of COVID, because there's certain people that are not taking consideration culture, that culture matters. And I was also told that culture does not matter. So what can we do to think differently? What can we do to not be what we aim, what we despise, or what we look down, we're like, yeah, that's not cool. How do we do things differently? So my 3 suggestions, as I mentioned earlier, are to note the gaps in your knowledge. Knowledge can come from everywhere or anywhere. Look at what already exists. It may not be directly in front of you, so you may have to do some digging. You may have to come out of your comfort zone and communicate with people you don't know. You may have to go to a completely different discipline to see if they have anything that they can put you on the right path and dig deeper. What other points of view are you missing? So sometimes what I do is I will think of an idea and I'm like, yes, this is important. I'll have all the reasons and the passion of why I need to do that thing. And then in order for me to be a fully aware researcher, I have to think of the opposite, like why it won't work and what all the haters are going to say. Not the haters from the like people are like, oh, there's no going to work. No, like what are the legitimate disagreements or points that they may have? Even if somebody you cannot stand, even if it's somebody who's got a really dated point of view and you don't like 90% of what comes out of their mouth, a dead clock is right twice a day. So if you can look at something that they're saying, just hear what they're saying, take the emotion out of it and just try to distill whatever may be factual and respond to that. Not only will that prepare you for a legitimate, well thought rebuttal, but it also may give you some research as to why they think that way. It can give you some insight as to why they think that way. And you can include that in your research studies so you have a more thorough, well-rounded perspective, and never be afraid to fail. Never get that out of your head. That's one of the reasons why people are, I think people don't want to try things, is because they're afraid to fail and they're afraid of how that's going to look or how it's going to affect them. So here are a few other examples, and specifically the Blackspace Manifesto. If you were paying attention, a lot of the things that I was already talking about were already listed in the Blackspace Manifesto, which is why I was like, what? How come I never heard of this before? And it was introduced to me through the people at the Taylor Center. And it's really important because it was created by Black urban planners, architects, artists, activists, and designers on how to protect and create Black spaces. Because we already know that there's certain populations in the world who are working in the preservation space and the social justice spaces to be able to have their voice heard and protect what they know. Well, there's Black members of the African diaspora who are doing the same thing to protect their spaces using interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary interventions and events to be able to share this knowledge. So I picked 7 of the 14 that I have talked to you about, and the things that I used in my personal life that I think might be useful to anybody else who wants to be a part of this dialogue. And they basically create circles, not lines. So I'm sort of anti-hierarchical. I acknowledge hierarchy where I work because I know who signs my checks, and that's who I ask if I have questions. When we leave that building, as far as I'm concerned, we all came out of somebody and we're going to become compost. So you are the same human being to me. I don't care what your title is or how many letters you have beside your name. But if I have a question, I know where I'm going to go because that's the pay scale. But in terms of problem solving and knowledge gathering, they have different knowledge than me. They don't necessarily have more knowledge than me, especially somebody who grew up the way that I did. So I try to acknowledge like less hierarchy and have more dialogue and try to empower everybody in the circles having a valuable input. Excuse me, moving at the speed of trust. Do not force yourself on people. Don't think that just because you have credentials or you're also Black that you're entitled to certain information, or even if you're well-meaning, just work at the space that they trust and just show. You have to earn that trust for them to share with you. Center on lived experience. We talked about that. I used my lived experience to try to come up with a solution that I didn't find anybody even talking about, which is about another sustainable alternative to help people protect their respiratory health. And the way that I'm doing it, it needs a lot more research, but as far as I can see, I'm not going to be creating more plastic stuff to drop in a landfill somewhere, right? So seek people at the margins. Anybody who thinks differently, that person who's quiet and you think is weird, go check them out because they're probably thinking differently and they can expand whatever it is you're working on. reckon with the past to build the future. That's exactly what I talk about, is I think that there's knowledge and sacred gems of things that people are already doing that it existed way long time ago. We can bring it in to solve contemporary problems if we just look. We have to get out of the siloed mentality of this is my discipline, this is what I got my degree in, this is how they teach us. We can do better. Excuse me. Protect and strengthen culture. I think by nature, if we're doing this, we are protecting culture. If we're using and acknowledging and citing our sources, we're talking to, like, we're promoted to do that. We're trained to do that when we're doing literature. I think it's extremely important to recognize that we could do that in practice. When we're going through these different cultures and we're trying to find different ways to manage forest fires and look at how indigenous populations in those areas had done controlled burning for centuries. So they didn't have the problem of devastation that we do now. We can look to other people, and so we can see what they're doing and strengthen their culture by promoting their practices and promote excellence. I've been told that I'm too nice. I've been told that I'm too friendly or I'm too on the box. People who really know me know how much I love my bed and how much I struggle with humanity because they break my heart and disappoint me. But when it comes to getting stuff done, I reach out to other people. I support other people, and it's authentic. If somebody's doing something cool or something unique, I reach out, send them an email. One of the jobs I have now, which I love so much, is I work with the Translational Science Institute, and they're doing the knowledge exchange, like taking the stuff that's in the studies, and they're working with Black churches to deal with cardiovascular issues or cardiovascular health. So I feel that this is really important because I reached out to that guy, the guy who won the $8 million grant to do that study over a year and a half ago. And I sent him an email saying, thank you for doing what you're doing. And if you need help, let me know. A year and a half later, they reached out to me and asked me to support them or to help them. So I've been working as a research assistant with them. So you got to reach out, and like, you just never know where your blessings will come from when you're authentic about supporting people. I wanted to share with you some literature. So if you wanted to know more, nothing pisses me off more than people talking about all these things I could do, should do, and I feel all inspired and I want to do stuff, but they don't leave me with anything that I can dig deeper on. I don't have the vocabulary to know which questions to ask, to know what research. This will hopefully get you started. And from the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry this took so long, but thank you so much. And I know that we're supposed to do an activity, but we're hitting up on 12 o'clock, so we're not going to have much time for the activity. But this is my email address. My name is Sunshine. My last name is Best. It's sbest2@tulane.edu. I'm also on Instagram. I'm very not super interesting in my posts. People are often bored because there's not a whole lot of like me doing this, but when I remember, I'll share things that I'm into, but I'm hoping to be able to be more active, to share what I've been studying and things that I want to do to build more community outside of my immediate circle. So I wanted to turn it over to you guys to fit it in if we can, because it's minutes to 12. And again, I apologize it took long. I get really impassioned, and this is the last talk that I'm going to have as a master's student because I graduate in a couple of weeks. So I'm just going to shut up and stop talking. But if you have any questions, I would love to hear questions, comments, or concerns.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Sunshine. My mind just continues to be blown every time you speak. Yeah, so I know we're near on 12, so if anybody has to go, please feel free to go, but we will stay on the line just to, we can introduce the activity and we will take any questions that anybody has. But Chris, did you have something to say before I introduce the activity?
No, just that was amazing. Thank you, Sunshine. I really appreciated the way that you did speak in a lot of detail about your previous work, but like, it's all worth going into. And there's something you said at the beginning about like, people say you're all over the place, but that's just kind of a narrow-minded way of viewing, having a brain that synthesizes a lot of interests and a lot of stimulus into these generative ideas that you couldn't really arrive at unless you were drawing from a lot of different fields and a lot of different inspirations. So appreciate your reframing that. I feel that I'm often kind of similar all over the place, but I appreciate you framing that as a positive.
Yeah. So just one last thing for anybody who has time to stay. So I would just like to invite people to think of a time when you held a mindset about something that was endorsed or confirmed by your immediate environment, and then something happened that influenced you to change your worldview. So you can take a moment just to think about this question. So again, I'll post it in the chat just for people to see. But again, so think about like an idea, like a mindset that you had that was endorsed by your environment, and then something happened to influence you to change your view, your point of view. So we'd love to hear your responses to that. And if anybody has any questions for Sunshine, feel free to ask us as well. Oh, there's some messages. No, everyone's just thanking you.
So it's totally fine if we weren't able to get to the exercise. I think we'll have more opportunities. We can make certainly more opportunities to work with you in the future, Sunshine. So there's, yeah, always more that can come from this. And I don't think we should be kicking ourselves for not having made it to that when we learned so much great stuff already. So no worries.
I mean, I could share for anyone who wants to listen. So I could share an experience that I had related to this. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guyana back in, started in June, ended March of 2020. So I remember when I had first gotten to my site, I was supposed to be working out as an adolescent health promoter and teaching a health curriculum in a school. And when the first day I had gone to the school to be introduced to everybody, one of the teachers there who worked in the school already, she had asked me, she's like, why are you even here? Like America has its own problems. Like, I don't really understand like why it is that you're here. And at first I was like so triggered for whatever reason by like that question. And I was like hurt. I was like, oh, well, like I'm here like to help you. Like my naive thinking was that. And then it wasn't until I started unpacking, I started thinking about this question more recently, actually. I'm currently in Dr. Laura Murphy's class, development theory, development issues. And I've been unpacking a lot of like my views about like Western culture and like development and like how we go about development. So I started thinking more about this question, thinking like, wow, like, why did that question bother me so much like when I was there? But I realized that it's because like I spent most of my life like growing up here in the United States, and obviously like the United States is seen as this like developed nation and like prestigious, and like we've got all these things going for us, like advanced technology, like paved roads, and like all this stuff. So, but I feel like it's not emphasized enough, like problems that do exist, like while we're considered like a developed nation, like what does that really mean? And so going to Guyana, I'm like, oh, well, like I'm here to help you. Like I've got things to teach you. And like now I'm like, who are you? Like there's so much that like you still have to learn, and like the people in Guyana like have so much that like they could teach me. And it was kind of naive of me to like go into that space thinking like, oh, I have like all this to offer you. And so yeah, that's my worldview. That's an example of like a mindset that I had about like how great something is, and then just an event happening, like my mind view, just my worldview being changed. Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Murphy.
Sunshine, I loved what you said about talking about when you're talking about kind of Western science, and how when we sort of say science that we're, it sort of implies this kind of Western approach with the scientific method that's very rooted in, reading the literature and, kind of doing this whole process and not necessarily, looking at kind of what people have been doing for a long time, because a lot of that really is proved by, time and how, these things have worked for people for so long. So I think that was a really, really interesting perspective that I think, I even need to think about more, because I think I still think about science in that way. So maybe that's my mindset that I came in, and it changed today. So good job.
Yeah, and going off of that, I feel like something else I had wrote down during your presentation is how like Indigenous medicine and science isn't really as revered in like literature. And I feel like even just like observing like my own teaching, like how I've been taught, like when it comes to like indigenous culture and like people, we're always being taught to see like through the lens of lack and like what they're lacking and like how like Western medicine like can help them. And we're not really giving a platform like for what they have to offer the rest of the world. So thank you for that and highlighting that, because I think that's like a perspective that I needed to be to start thinking about more. It's like thinking less in lack and more of like abundance, like what other cultures and people have to offer.
Sunshine, I have a question. So I am curious about, you talk a little bit about problem solving in the context of problems you've had, ones you can empathize with. Can you discuss pulling from the toolbox of problem solving for problems outside of your scope, problems you might not be able to empathize with, but you can definitely pull from circles and hear their stories, but yet it's still difficult because it's not your experiences. So can you maybe talk about that toolbox a little bit?
Sure, thank you. You always come with these fire questions, which is why I feel like meeting you, I was thinking about this, and I know it's, God, saying this out loud sounds creepy. So I for some reason think a lot, I think really well when I'm near or in water. I don't know if that's coming from, because I come from an isle that's 166 square miles. So I'm really tiny. So I have a connection with water, but I was in the shower and you Hannah, you really came to mind. Creepy sounding, didn't mean it that way. But I basically, I was thinking about how grateful I am to you, because every time I went to a country, and I'm like, I'm just going through the motions. I'm like, I'm just gonna work on a farm and see what happens. I'm like, okay, I need money. I got to figure out how to cook, and I need figure out how to where I can cook or help clean someone's house or something for money so I can get to the next place. Just before I was like, okay, I got the next ticket or the next set of money to get from A, B, and C. Just before I'm ready to leave, because I feel like, okay, this experience has exhausted itself, somebody or something happens where I'm like, what? I've been looking for that. Oh my God, I didn't even know that was a thing. I need, want, desire more of that. But I'm leaving. That always happens. And now I'm graduating and I just found you. Because ever since I met you, I mean, we met, for people on the call, I met Hannah downstairs coming into the building the morning after Ida hit. And so I'm like, I'm all about community, right? So I'm like, I don't know you, you're in school, you're a master's student, and you're speaking to me. Let's just exchange information. It was me, you, and your boyfriend. And so we connected. And every time I see you, you drop these fire questions that I'm like, oh God, I didn't think of that. Or, give me some time and I'll get back to you. So that what you're saying is another one. So to answer your question, I have been in circles many times where I was like, okay, I feel somewhat awkward to be here because I have no experience with this situation, whether it's something like coming into Tulane, because I had I suffer from being very vulnerable. I suffer from depression. Like I constantly, if it wasn't for Romana keeping me motivated to do this, because I'm like, I don't know what to talk about. Nobody's gonna care. I don't know what to talk about. And she was so enthused about this. Like I wouldn't have had that headspace. When I was at the day that after I got accepted here, I was on the streetcar and someone asked me to come up and see them. And I'm like, I don't even know if I'm going to fit in. I was going to be humiliating because I'm going to flunk out. And I just didn't feel like I had anything to offer this space either. And I would be feeling what I've always felt in many circles from being an orphan, foster care, in different group homes. Like, I'm like, I don't belong here and I don't have anything in common with these people. So one of the things that feeling was echoed every time I took myself to a new country and I put myself in that situation, which was the interesting thing to negotiate my mind. But once I started, I started focusing on them and what was coming out of their mouth and learning to impart empathy. All of the self-awareness, discomfort, these insecurities fell away because I was 100% invested in what was coming out of their mouth. And once I became invested in what they were saying and their point of view and their perspective and their lived experience, I found more humanity in whatever was coming out of their face or whatever they were talking about or whatever their feeling was. And I could feel what they were feeling at different points. And that humanness is what connected me to these different groups. So from those, I could go and I think people misunderstand, especially people who don't know me personally. They think I'm the most confident extrovert, but it was this experience, this repeated experience. And I still kind of battle with it. And I still find myself in circles, and I push myself into circles where I have nothing in common with people, and then try to employ this mindset and this vibe of like, just be and listen and take in and mind those gaps and take mental notes. And I found that I was able to absorb more from them on an empathetic level. I'm hoping this makes sense, but I can take more from the experience and add to my toolbox, because even if there's not a solution that comes out of the dialogue, the fact that I know what they said and I felt what they felt, that's emotional intelligence. That also matters. The Western way of learning that I've been experiencing since I've lived in the 6 states in this country I've lived in is that there's so much more value on tactile knowledge or tactile experiences or tactile things or degree holding knowledge, that people forget about the importance of that empathy connection that connects you, that builds your emotional intelligence. And I feel like that is a part of your toolbox. And that when I can feel that empathy, or I can feel those scenarios, and even if they're experiences that I can't relate to, for instance, the one example I'll give you from foster care, which is the first time I'm like thinking I'm talking about it. It was, I was in homes with a lot of different people, and they came from a lot of different backgrounds. And one of the girls that I was in foster care with was, we were kids. So I don't remember how she got there, but, or what ethnic background, but she came from a country where there were landmines, and she had a disfigured arm and a foot because of something that happened with landmines or whatever country she came from. And then something happened to her parents that landed her in foster care with me. And it was the first time of me as a child, coming across somebody who didn't have 5 fingers and 10 toes, and that had like a strong accent from another part of the world. And listening to her talk and listening to how she navigates the world and her lived experience and what happened to her mom and dad. And she didn't like talking about how the accident happened, but she did. And I can't relate to any of that. Like, as messed up as my childhood was, it landed me in the situation I was in. I knew it wasn't my fault. It was the people around me that circumstances happen. But to listen to this girl talk about her challenges, it has given me a level of empathy, or helped me train me in terms of being empathetic with these situations. If you're there, does that answer your question, or does that relate to what you're discussing or what you brought
That
up?
all relates. And this is like
Okay.
coming into human-centered design that you and I have discussed. And so I am loving this. And I really appreciate your words that you began with. I feel very fortunate to meet you and discuss these topics and hopefully make moves and change the world.
And I also want to ask you, thank you for saying that, but I also want to make sure that you're okay with me constantly introducing you people as an ally. Like,
why would I not be okay with that?
I introduced
the biggest compliment. Thank you so much, Sunshine.
Thank you, Hannah.
Wow, 2 of my favorite people knowing each other. I love that. Any other questions? Anybody?
I'm surprised we have this many hangers-ons.
I know, me too. But actually, no, I'm not that surprised, because everyone's captivated by you and what you have to say.
Yeah, it's a good conversation. Why not hang around?
Yeah.
So Sunshine, I've had a couple years experience with the Blackspace Manifesto and the principles, sharing about them, talking about them, using them as a reference as a built environment designer in architecture and planning. As someone coming from a different background, did you find that there was any challenges to using them in what you were doing, or did you feel like that didn't really matter and they were fully just as applicable to you as they were for anyone coming from built environment design fields?
Thank you, Professor, for answering that, because I did think about it originally from different facets. So being that I own my interdisciplinary, all over the place brain. So I call myself a scientist only recently, because people will call me scientist, like, "Ooh, I don't know, I don't have an MS and I like a Master of Science, and I didn't take a whole lot of biology," because I compare myself to all these microbiologists I'm surrounded by, especially in my department. So I never put myself in that space. But then I started realizing from the definition of science that we discussed here that like, yeah, I do exercise a part of science. And I also feel like once I recognize the context of the facet that I was looking from, so if I'm working with all the community work that I used to do outside of Tulane, I just did it because I felt like, oh, they wanted to know something and I know how to do that thing. And it would be good because I believe in knowledge transfer and exchange. So I am going to learn about New Orleans population that's different than the low socioeconomic Caribbean population and the low socioeconomic Chicago population. They were all Black, but they all have a different lived experience. So I was interested in learning from them as well. So I would look at the Blackspace Manifesto, and I was actually smiled when I read the line that there was like urban planners and physical space people, because I'm like, all of this can fit into this field. It can fit into this. It can fit into this. The only challenge that I had to think about it deeper over a couple of days was the like chemical, biological, like the people who are microbiologists, like from that field, that level of like chemical science. I was like, well, how does this relate to them? If you are like, I don't want to deal with people, I just want to study molecules, how does this affect them? Like, how does this apply to them? So I had to think about it. And I'm like, well, ultimately, people are studying what's in water because people drink and depend on water. People are studying what's in soil because things grow in soil and soil impacts us. So like, even if you're looking at the molecules from the environmental public health space, ultimately humans are involved, right? And so if you weren't looking at how things work or how to address an issue or how to approach a certain problem, maybe looking at a different culture's version of science or a different cultural lived experience with science might help you with that, right? So if we're talking about like in my department of environmental health, and there's like 3 people who study water and one of them kind of does soil. And if they start talking, which I wish they did study plants here, but if they did study plants or talking about lead that's found in different types of rice, there's certain groups who have been using Verigrass, I think it's called. There's different groups that have, I think in South India, they use a type of grass that help with soil erosion that also pull certain chemicals out of the soil. So maybe you can find a plant that kind of absorbs lead or arsenic, if they in culture, and people have been doing it for centuries. Maybe they don't know they've been using it for arsenic or lead, but maybe if they're using this to help change the soil quality, check and see which plants can see, does that make sense? Like, I feel like if you think about it deep enough, there's always a way to tap into how to look at something differently or how to apply a more just, balanced mindset to whatever science that you're in, especially because it's knowledge, right? And ultimately knowledge affects people. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So we're getting to our lower numbers now. I see 8.
Okay.
I'm using that as like my countdown of like, I think people are gone now.
Okay, yeah, we're like almost 20 minutes over, so maybe we should wrap it up.
I just checked my email and saw that they're reinstating the indoor mask mandate.
Oh, really?
I was waiting for that actually, because there was a resistance holding through. There was a resistance at there was a alumni thing a few weeks ago, and they went to this barbecue pit, and me and like 5 other people walked around, and it was like the before times. There was nobody wearing masks. I'm like, but we're indoors, and I'm so torn, and like it was very confusing for me. So I was like, I wonder, as a school of public health, and Omaron's back, so I wonder if this is going to be a thing. So I have my creepy offensive mask on the ready, and I am ready to rock it to just keep messing with people's heads in the elevator.
Love it.
It helps keep me awake.
I love it.
All right.
Cool. That's it, I guess. I don't know what else to say. And I'm hoping that people took something from it. And I'm hoping that I'm a work in progress. I'm just sharing with my experience so far. And I'm hoping my life experience and sharing could be of value to people.
Absolutely.
Has been.
Thank you
for
everyone that's left. You're hopping off, Christoph?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
I'll see you, Christoph.
Joining us.
Christoph is my pixie. Mwah. Bye, my muse.
All right. Thanks for everyone else that kept hanging on and to hear the conversation. I wish everyone a lovely rest of your day. Sunshine, thank you.
Thank you,
so
Amanda. Thank
much.
you, Chris. Thank you for you hanger honors. Have a beautiful weekend or holiday, whatever you celebrate.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.